Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Leaf Collectivo. With me is not other one than Thomas Parrott, an expansion architect. That's what he's doing now, and he's niching out and niching out and niching out, and he's doing great. Thomas, welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here, Gilbert. I appreciate the invitation.
No, it is great to catch up again and to learn everything that you're doing now and how your new gig is coming along. We met last year or a couple of years ago in your previous gig, and it's interesting because with you came a whole different level of maturity in data analysis and the way brands actually look at profitability data and all that. And when we were putting together the kind of like the plan for this season, we thought of no other person than you to talk about profitability, contribution margins, marketplaces of all things, which is its own category.
Yeah.
I would say of how you should be looking at things. So yeah, thanks for taking the time to be here
Well,
with us
I
today.
appreciate the introduction, and yeah, I look. It's as you know, I've been kicking around a while in the direct commerce space, and the premise of how we looked at profitability back in the day when I was working on big book mail order catalogs in the late '90s, and then working in infomercials in the sort of 2000s. We just looked at things differently, I guess. It was very granular, and especially an infomercial. And so we've really just taken that same lens and applied it to e-commerce as e-commerce grew up. And okay, it's a little bit harder with some of those elements, but that's essentially, when we talk about the maturity of analytics, that's really just taking old school ideas and applying them to new technology.
And that's a very interesting concept of taking old school ideas, and because a lot of people think analytics is a new thing, like looking at data is a new thing. I think it's a new thing for many people, but back in the day, you had to actually look at the data, especially because data was scarce at the time. So you actually needed to be a lot more disciplined about the stuff that you could had a look at.
I was saying to someone the other day, and I'm really aging myself now, that when we were first looking at data in catalogs, when I was in my first role at Freeman's Mail Order, it was like 96, 97, and we were just every Monday we were given a couple of inches of computer printout. It was printed on paper which has little holes down the side, and it was a stack of paper, and you had a ruler, and you went through line by line every single SKU and every variant, and you had to sort of manually sort it out, and we didn't have this is Excel was kind of before Excel. We were using Lotus 123, which is like people don't even know this is where we were starting from, and so I suppose you learn a different way because the technology was not there to do all of this the analytics. So yeah, so it makes me laugh because that's where we started with this very manual process, and so in my brain I still probably write down a lot of stuff and on square paper and stuff because that's how I've always learned it.
It's an interesting one because I do that as well. I mean, and I'm a gadget freak, and I have all the different things. But I kind of always, when I need to do some focus work, I always default to piece of paper first, right? And to kind of like jot down, kind of like your ideas. I know Wes does that as well a lot. Like he has this little notebook, and even doing mathematical equations, which it's mental because a lot of people would probably don't even think about that, and
Yeah.
and they go straight to computer, but you kind of go there because it allows you that clarity of focus, but at the same time it allows you to kind of like connect with all that knowledge and experience that you've gained over the years, especially doing the things manual sort of way now,
Well, I think
kind
it
of projecting
also
that to the new tools.
I think it also, when you get new tools, and don't get me wrong, I'm not a dinosaur. I'm using some, and have used some really interesting new technology and new platforms with analytics. Notwithstanding the work we've done with Leaf in the past, but the I think the thing that you really get when you've done stuff manually is the ability to sense check data. And sometimes something looks out or too good to be true. Sometimes, like, maybe the opposite. But you get a sixth sense for that because you've done the calculations manually before, and so you see where something might be in or out.
Now, obviously, profitability is all about knowing your numbers, and this is something that we have explored and covered quite a bit on this podcast, and in any panel that we do. It's about knowing your unit economics, understanding what really goes into building and offering and servicing your product, and all of that. What has been your experience in working with brands and working with with founders? I think probably more than anything else, in understanding those numbers and how critical they are.
I think it often depends on where the founder started or how they started their business and how fast they grew, and sometimes it's just their generation. It's a generational thing as well. I tend to find that in more newer companies, newer brands, the understanding of profitability, really understanding their P&L, is lost in relation to their, as you say, unit economics is really, it's definitely a fascinating one. But where does all the money go? And I suppose, looking at infomercials, when we were running infomercials, we had a metric of contribution before media, which is essentially everything we needed to do to cover up to a media, and then to fixed costs beyond that. And okay, you can align that with different CM1, 2, but fundamentally that was how we talked about everything. And when you start to unpick that number and you look at the variations within that and what are the levers you can move, you really start to understand where you can increase, another old school term, but increase your allowable for how much you can spend on media as well. So there is, I think sometimes there's a reverse look. You've probably seen it in what you do, where like we want to spend this much, or we want to have this ROAS, or that's the starting point. And for me, the starting point is not that. The starting point is building out. Let's look at the P&L and let's break down every single number to start off with, and then let's work out how we make profit and what we can afford to spend on media.
Yeah, and that's interesting because a lot of people are chasing the silver bullets. They're chasing the 10x ROAS, as if that was like the default answer to anything, rather than understanding that even like that target ROAS, at least to start, is actually the output of a lot of other things. 100%. And understanding you're not, rather than becoming the starting point. Like you said, a lot of people will come as like, we need a 10x ROAS, or we need a 5x ROAS, or whatever. And it's like, one of the first things that we ask is why, right? Like, where did that number came from? And if there is no answer, then the first thing that we do is sitting down with them and then trying to figure it out actually what it should be. It doesn't mean that you should not have a stretch target, but I think they need to be realistic and attuned to the reality of the business. Because I mean, you might be able to be delivering 10x ROAS and still losing money, or not even making means for servicing the business. A lot of people getting higher ROAS at a lower spend, it's a lot easier than getting proper ROAS as you scale budgets. But everything has to be in proportion to actually what you're doing as a business, and what you need to to deliver to.
I think it's as well, just when you understand those, when you understand the numbers, and the levers of where they come from, it's one thing for the brand to understand it, but it's super important, the brand, and not just the senior leadership. And I go back to the premise of business, of the speed of thought, and the sharing data across the entire organization is really helpful. And so often the C-level, the director levels are holding all this information around P&Ls and what contributes to that, or it might just all be in a finance function and they don't share it down. And so there isn't the understanding down in the marketing or other parts, operation side of the business, of what their impact of what they're doing is having in the top of the P&L. And so that's an important factor to start off with. But and I always encourage any brands that I work with to share everything. It's like, what is the risk of sharing your P&L with the staff, even if it's down to the admin level staff? What is the risk versus the potential reward of them seeing something that is maybe a light bulb moment that someone at the top of the organization wants to see? And that's, Bill Gates was talking about that as in his Business at Speed of Thought book. What is it, 2000, I think it was, when he wrote that. But what often happens is that brands don't share that information with their agencies either. And I think one of the big sort of aha moments when we were working, when I was working in a brand, in a retailer, and working with Leaf, was that there was a genuine understanding. No one, I'd never really worked with agencies that had asked or clamored or wanted the additional information because it supported the argument for certain strategies. And I think it's really important that brands and agencies want to share that information as well. Like, again, what is the risk? The risk of sharing that information is very unlikely to be that high relative to the reward.
It is super important. I was talking to somebody recently, the owner of another agency, and he was asking me why we chose to give brands answers, and why do we wanted that, them access that to that platform and the data as it is. Mm-hmm. And it's like giving the gun to the person that is going to be holding it in your head, because in many ways that's how it feels, right? I mean, mm-hmm. That's how, because especially in performance, and especially as you're growing, I mean, it's a high stress environment, right? In terms of like what you do. But the reason I said is because that's about holding us accountable and holding the brand accountable as well to the results. Because oftentimes, brands will tend to put a lot of the responsibility in the agencies, as they should. I mean, and there should be a level of accountability there, because that's what, they're being hired for. But equally, it's a system. It's an ecosystem that, there are things that are outside of our control. Product, for example, is outside of our control. Returns is outside of our control. But just because it's outside of our control doesn't mean that we should not have visibility of it, or even figuring out ways that we can improve that. And even if it is about understanding even the, because again, right, you would expect that people are looking at that data, but even at the granularity of the data, like returns, for example, right? If you see spikes in returns and you're able to tell the brand, hey guys, like, did something happen? And this is an example of happened with a fashion brand that we were working with. There was a spike in returns, and they had not noticed, the spikes, before we did, and we talked to them about, and I realized that the last shipment that they have got from came in the wrong sizing, so they were getting a lot of returns out of that, and then we were able to kind of like adapt to it and then figure out how to do it, and then we were able to maintain return. And again, it's not something that you should argue agencies should be worrying about, because there would be a merchandising team and and a lot of other things in there, but having access to the data makes sure that everybody's kind of like pushing towards the same objective, as it should be. It
also can be just down to the creative creating a return. And, so I go back to the old days of infomercial, but if we were selling something on infomercial, those 30-minute presentations in the middle of the night on some random digital channel, even then before there's like some satellite channels, and something was said in that particular advertising that didn't connect with the consumer in the right way, or they didn't understand what we were trying to get across. Maybe we were overselling it or something. Then it would create higher returns, right? So you can, from a creative point of view, you can impact your return rate. It doesn't have to be a fault with the product, and can be a fault in the way that product is sold. And so just understanding that from a agency point of view means that you can tweak that creative. You can test against, are we overselling, or is there something we're not explaining really well on this particular product, that actually sometimes some small change in the way you describe something massively changes the impact of the return rate, and therefore drop down into the profitability of the entire campaign.
So as we go into this, and especially I want to have some time to talk about marketplaces, because that's a whole piece on its own. But what would you think, and based on your experience, like that brands should start thinking on, like, and I know you've been working on a framework that, especially looking at expansion of brands and understanding, pretty much from the ground up, what goes in there. But where should brands start? If they're not there yet, and as it evolves, where should they be kind of like aiming towards?
So, this whole thing started as I left, full time running company CEO of an e-commerce business to strike out on my own, and my initial instinct was doing what I'd done for a long time, which was supporting mostly US brands coming into the UK European market, and how they were going to do that, and do it profitably, because I'd seen so many examples in my time working with brands where they had misstepped in various ways. And as I drilled into how to explain this better to them, I realized that I needed to deep dive into the P&L piece and the profitability of the SKUs they were bringing across. And quite often you had these conversations where it's like, yeah, we've got like 50 SKUs or even more sometimes. And so it's trying to hold back. Okay, let's go through this first of all. You don't want to bring in all of those. Let's try and keep this efficient. Let's look at the most profitable. Let's look at what's the most likely. Let's do a study. And so it became a framework of trying to put in a piece by piece what is the first task here of let's look at your corporate structure and the products you want to bring in and what the regulatory requirements against those. And then the next piece was, okay, now we know these products will be a fit in the market. What is the potential profitability, the contribution margin for these? Because in my view, although going into a new market, it's not necessarily instant gratification. You don't necessarily instantly become profitable. Like there's costs that you have to cover as capex stuff, but there is for sure a route to giving yourself the best chance of success fast, and then building on that success. And so understanding the individual components of the contribution, and then beyond that, looking at, okay, what are the other fixed costs that will need to be covered before we get into any of the discussion around how much we want to spend on meta advertising or anything else like that, Amazon, whatever it is. It doesn't matter. It's before all of that, what can we do? And so what the framework became, kind of by mistake, I suppose, because I had not envisaged this was where it was going to end up, was that I became this sort of contribution margin guy with no finance back. I never did a finance degree. I joked yesterday on a LinkedIn post about you don't want to have closed door meetings with your CFO, and I think that's what I suggest. The problem I solve for brands is not having them have closed door meetings with CFOs, by helping them understand the importance of contribution to the success of their business. And so I started that with US businesses. Funnily enough, it sort of ended up becoming a bit more of a monster with other businesses wanting to go into other places. Just this month it started with can you do Dubai? Yes. So that's like, yeah, we can do that. And then we had the UK brands who just wanted to grow, but they, had they maxed out their meta, their advertising spend? Where are other places they could accumulate? And that went back to, well, if you unpick your contribution margin, then we can potentially free up more money for your advertising spend, and also let's look at your fixed costs as well, because there's probably a bunch of stuff that will help with your profitability. And because of my experience of doing, I've been an all-rounder. I'd started in buying and merchandising, and then I'd got into so operational stuff and selling and creative with infomercials, and then I'd gone into running whole organizations, and whether it was warehouses and carriers and then running working with agencies very closely and building out entire sort of international profiles. All of those things come to one. It's like I suppose because I was a bit of a jack of all trades. I was able to see how the contribution margins impacted every part of the business, and what I realised was that organisations don't share that across. Here, finance think it might be a marketing thing. Marketing think it's a finance thing. Operations think that returns is a merchandising thing. So if no one's talking in these organizations, and especially in a more remote first world, where and where there's more 3PLs than back in the day when lots of people had their own warehouses, you saw stuff going in and out. I was just talking to a brand this morning. They have their own facility. They know the contribution margin effect of seeing a pallet of returns, because they know next month that's going to appear on their P&L, and there's going to be an impact to that. And so they ask, they can go into their own warehouse and see this is important. And so when you start to train that in across the entire organization, this is what the impact is to you, and this is what you can do about it. That makes the difference. And so that what I try to help brands really understand is the impact of each individual layer of the organization to the components that make up contribution. And then beyond that, the other areas where they can constantly reevaluate what is it that's impacting the bottom line profitability.
That's so interesting. I was talking to somebody yesterday that because Leaf, grew remotely during the pandemic, and we've remained as such since. I have never got kind of like the visibility, the physical visibility of how big our organization has grown. Right. Last time I had everybody in a room, we were about 15. And it was not until last year I attended an event, and there were like 60 people in the room, and I took took stock at that moment. It's like, oh, this is about the size of Leaf, and it kind of chucked me at that moment. Yeah. And to your point, and I was talking to Lawrence from the mothership recently, and they moved out of 3PL to their own warehousing, and and then that got them to start thinking about cash conversion, and and that the ratio of like the stuff that they have sitting there, and then like there's actually money, and then how fast can they turn that into money. And I feel like these days, with this whole digital world, virtual world that we live in, it's so difficult to take stock of all the different things of a business, and everything kind of like jots down to a spreadsheet at the end of the day. But the most difficult of that is that especially the P&L becomes an afterthought, or is like it becomes a thing of the past. You always look at the P&L and it's a past
it's built nearly, sometimes I've been in organizations where they're building the P&L a month after and so you haven't even had a chance to fix anything for another month because you're not seeing it, because finance are keeping it to themselves, and they've got all these other processes they want to run before they even share it, which is obviously very dangerous as well. It's something
it is because you don't have a handle on it, right? And to a certain extent, that's why we built Leaf, and has the Answers platform has all that kind of like as real time information as possible, because we want and why we mix trade with marketing and all this to be able to get as closer of a view as possible to the reality. But to your point, understanding all those unit economics backwards after the fact, it gives you like very little time to actually have be in control. I was talking to somebody last night on the train on the way back, and he by luck, is this entrepreneur. He has exited like 5 different businesses, and he's kind of like working now for fun in a way. In one of his the last business that he sold, they asked him to come back, and he was talking about how having kind of like being in control of the agenda, being in control of the process. And he's like, I personally don't focus about targets. I focus about the process and the continuity and what's going on, and understanding that the stuff that you're putting in, the score kind of takes care of itself, at the end. And he's like, it doesn't mean that I'm not managing that, but I'm not targeting everybody on that. I'm targeting everybody on the today, on what are you doing today that will contribute to that past. And I think that for a lot of brands, the sexy part is the the media spend, the ROAS, the this, like that's the acceleration part, like that's the fun part, the exciting part. Numbers is actually almost look
It's
as a I have to do
yeah,
type of thing. And I think it's, the other way around will makes it even probably more fun, because it means that, like you said, it will free you up to actually do more, and having like a clear end in mind, of where you want
it's
to go.
at Beachbody, when we were running infomercials for a long time, and then we moved into digital acquisition and online acquisition. But one of the I suppose strategic leads, VP of strategy for the business for a long time while I was there, was a guy called Babak Azad, and if anyone sort of reads his blogs, he writes some very cool stuff still. And has done some very cool stuff after the fact. But he created this input called a margin model, which was still something I use now to function in terms of understanding the spend and the allowable spend we can have. And it's lots of the stuff that we in that is what I've discussed with agencies in the past, notwithstanding the stuff we've done with Leaf, but. The core function of that was everyone in the brand part of the Beachbody organization was made to be responsible for the individual costs within that. And you had to, and what we saw was that if you could, and let's go old school and talk about, we had a call center with a script. So if you could fire a bunch of calls into the call center, and you had one particular call center which was outperforming another call center, because you were running multiple call centers at the time, then you would switch all your calls into that call center. Then you would test the script, and you were running two different scripts, and now you could take that script A, and that script converted more calls at a higher average order value than script B. So now you move into that script. Now, if you apply, everything we did there, when you applied it into a margin model, gave you an increased potential contribution before media, which allowed you to spend more money. So we were always looking at, can we have a 20% margin and then we have our media, then we have to cover our media spend. So 20% would cover our fixed costs. That was kind of the assumption that we built in as the basis of the business. And so you can imagine now, if we're fixing all of these elements of the business by understanding every incremental piece, and sometimes there was 100 inputs that we could tweak, 100 levers that we could tweak, and you would play with every single one, and you would make it. And when you played it with them in a model, when you start to model it out, you could suddenly see that you could jump an allowable spend per, allowable being the cost per acquisition. That you are prepared to spend for acquiring one customer. You could sometimes shift that by $10, 10 quid. And that was the game-changing part of understanding and so when you start to think about, okay, how can we apply this to e-commerce? Well, exactly the same way is looking at the creative, looking at the meta copy, looking at the images, looking at the videos, whatever it is. What did we say? What was that hook? And then you look at every single thing. Okay, let's look at the landing page. Let's look at what is the color of our checkout button. And we were doing tests is that granular where we would see uplifts with color wheels were amazing for us. Anyone who's never used a color wheel to design buttons against a web page should take a look at some of the research on that. But those little things would create uplifts. Every single uplift incrementally gave us another 50 cents here, 50 pence there, 5 euros on this particular campaign. And then you add that all together, and all of a sudden you're spending a ton more money. Now that is, when you get into that, it's way more exciting when you see those uplifts than just having a really great campaign on Meta that, maybe it's flying and you think it's doing great.
And it's getting great engagement.
Yeah.
So let's look at marketplaces. Now, that kind of like increases the level of complexity.
Oh my God. Yeah. The choice now as well is insane, right? Who could have imagined where we would come with, Tesco's and Debenhams and now Next, of course, of playing, and all the stuff that Miracle are doing is very cool. But there's, so much other stuff going on beyond, where we were just, we were worrying about Amazon and Etsy and a few. Now Walmart were in London last week seeing people. There's a lot going on, right? It's really wild.
Yeah, and it's also understanding again, like now you're getting a factor of complexity above, it's probably multiple levels up,
Yeah,
but also it's about understanding, understanding those unique economics even become a lot more difficult
but
because now, especially, like data now becomes part of the moat that a lot of these, marketplaces, will have. And, as a brand, especially if you're playing direct to consumer and, through multi-market, you will have to start to kind of like creating a completely different set of skill set internally to be able to manage that, and looking at the the halo effect that some of the work that you would be doing and vice versa that will have on your brand.
I think
um
you really hit on it there with that the halo effect piece of running any of these marketplaces and the impact that that has on your other your D2C, your Shopify, even if you had an Amazon business and now you've got a Debenhams business, and now how you it it's gonna be, whatever happens, it can really get more complicated. And I'm always super dubious of these sort of magical tools that I see advertised on LinkedIn or whatever, that some latest marketing mix thing that's going to solve all these problems and going to suddenly see all of this customer visibility, because we all know, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, it doesn't exist. I'll give you a fun example. I am also invested and co-founded in a baby blanket business that I just, it's a lot of fun. We started it with some old buddies from the infomercial world. We started it just before Christmas, and I actually had a problem with a customer's order, and I picked up the phone and we had a chat and we figured it out. But I said to her, like, where did you find us? I'm always about the attribution, right? And she said, well, first I saw you on Instagram, then I went to TikTok, and then I went to your Shopify site. And I'd like, okay, said to my co-founders, attribute that. Like, what are you going to do with that information? And that's that fundamentally is the problem, that that data isn't shared amongst anywhere. So where are these sales coming from, and how do we figure out the cost of that? Because she also clicked on one of my Amazon ads or other things, that would have been a little cost here or there as well. So there's so many different variables there that we have to deal with. And you can look at this and you have to look at this in a granular fashion, as taking each individual marketplace as a separate store on its own, as if you've done nothing else, because you have to understand the intricacies of that, and also the costs. Like, actually, funnily enough, talking to a prospective client earlier today about the costs of a marketplace they're working with in the US, and how suddenly the costs have risen, like, very dramatically, and they're like hidden costs almost, because they're costs within the shipping profiles and things that they hadn't caught or noticed. So first of all, you've got all of that going on in the individual marketplaces. Suddenly something changes. Amazon are devils for suddenly telling you you've got a different storage fee than the one you had a month before. But then you've also got to look at it holistically, as you say, within the halo effect, and you've got to look at it from the whole business perspective of what that supports. I think that unless brands who are applying into all of their businesses into all of these marketplaces are willing to get their hands dirty in looking at the individual numbers at contribution level by marketplace, as well as then taking a gut feel for the overall revenue impact or potential positivity, life is going to get very hard and very uncomfortable.
Yeah, and it's funny. We have this example with one of the brands in our portfolio, where suddenly you're also competing against yourself in those marketplaces, because then, like you said, right? People saw an ad on Instagram, they got retargeted by some, UCG content in TikTok. They went and Googled for it, and then suddenly you're also presented with your offering plus that of your partners, and and even from a pricing management point of view, because there are certain partners that might outprice your own brand, and how do you control even those bits? Because ultimately, like you said, all of those, you might end up doing the groundwork and then losing the final purchase to one of your partners, one of the marketplaces that are, carrying you on. But and then they are claiming the sale in many ways, but the costs associated to that and all this. And I think it's all right, I guess, at the end of the day, because it's the game. So I don't think there is a wrong answer against it. Somebody was telling us, it's like, I'm going to tell my partners that they cannot beat on me. I was like, doesn't quite work like that. And then you have the brand, and then you have the non-brand stuff, and it's a bit of a Wild West type of thing. I mean, they're carrying you over, and if you start becoming pricky on it, they might lower like the visibility of your catalog and all that. And I think it's just about accepting the fact that reality is like that, and then how do you play within those rules. And like you said, it's treating each channel on its own, and then understanding how do you maximize the potential.
And I think there's an element of the importance of the channel from a visibility point of view versus a margin point of view. You can be on some channels, it's fine to be on Amazon, but not have to do the whole FBA thing if that's not your boat, or not have everything on there and have, and there's really great examples of brands that do that, where you have a core set of products in the Amazon, you get the reviews, but actually what you're really trying to do is pull people back into your Shopify or D2C. And I think similarly you can do the same with all of those marketplaces. You've just got to play, in some respects, you've got to play a game again of really good merchandising, and that is, again, it's an old school skill of trying to understand the best placements for these individual products against the customer profiles of each individual marketplace, and then understanding the implications of the costs of each individual marketplace. Because if you've got, especially like some of them, okay, you're drop shipping, as it were, but if you're putting stock in as well, there's cost implications for that. It starts to add up.
What do you think? Especially as things start to stack up, and especially we're seeing a lot of fast-growing brands with very lean teams. And again, because it becomes super simple to just install an app on your Shopify, and suddenly you're in like a handful of marketplaces and all that. And people don't necessarily think about the implications of what that means. And again, it comes with the level of maturity in the business. But when you're moving like 1,000 miles an hour, everything is a bit of in hindsight in a way, and not everybody has a Thomas in the team that is actually looking, at the numbers in the way that they get seen and all that. Like, how do you think people should start prioritizing some of this?
The interesting thing that, and I've seen this happen in brands, is that they switch on Shopify Markets International, and sure, we'll fire up a bunch of countries. And what's the worst that can happen? And actually, what the worst that can happen is that no one's looking at the returns, or especially when you start getting into international returns, where returns don't necessarily come back for some reason because they're stuck in customs, or they've lost in some way, or they didn't get to the final destination. So actually, what you end up is, sometimes if you have a siloed organization, the international doesn't really get put to the front. You have customer service reshipping product at great expense. You've got goods coming back, and I've seen bills for, I remember a product going out to Corsica, I think it was, and Royal Mail charged us 80 quid to bring it back, because the customer had decided they didn't want it when it got to the door. And so you have to have people who are looking at that and understanding the implications of that, because that might have wiped out the profitability of Corsica, and maybe you don't want Corsica as a country you're going to ship to anymore. And so there are taking that level of care and understanding those pieces, so splitting it down. The other really interesting element for international, that brands do this, but they tend to, these brands spend a lot of time looking at their free shipping thresholds and various other elements for their core home business. But but they tend to make it up on the hoof for their international, and it should be different, because the makeup of how customers are buying and how much they're buying in different countries is fundamentally different, and also the cost of shipping into those individual countries. I remember spending quite a long time doing a matrix of something like 30 countries, I think it was, for the shipping rates and then the average weight of every item we were sort of shipping there, and then trying to work back where our shipping threshold should be and how much it was actually costing us as an organization. And the results were quite shocking, but it also gave me leverage to go back to the carrier and say, we can't do this anymore. So figure it out. You can, I could lose the business, but it's actually costing us more money. When you're going into international, it's having having people who are doing this stuff in the UK and making sure that they're doing, or their home market, and making sure they're doing it also for individual international markets. And quite often that means having a really, really great relationship with, if it's your own warehouse, great, make sure your warehouse manager is all over it. If it's a 3PL, you need to make sure that you have a really great relationship with them, and they're telling you what stuff is coming back and where it's coming from, or you're going down to that facility. I used to, my 3PLs used to hate me because I would be there all the time looking at stuff and picking. I didn't want them to process the returns until I'd seen everything, because it gave me a visualization of what was the problem and how what do we need to do to fix it, because I knew what the impact that could have on the business if we could find reductions in that area. So that is, I think, being that granular as you go into international, notwithstanding all of the implications for tax nexus and all these other things that I get involved with brands coming into the UK and into Europe especially, where you suddenly find, as US brands find this very quickly, that they've put product into France. They didn't mean to. They did it with a marketplace or something. All of a sudden, they've created a nexus. They haven't thought about this. There's some corporate structure work they really should have done beforehand. And so all of these little things as well that eventually they impact their home market profitability potentially, especially if a particular country's jurisdiction has a right to come after your profit. So there's different things that I can go, I go down loads of rabbit holes with this stuff with brands, because when they go into international, trying to keep everything super structured is really important. And that includes going into marketplaces. Marketplaces is so exciting right now with so much movement and so many opportunities to expand into new countries as well. And yet there is so much risk with getting it wrong because you just turned it on.
That's super interesting. I mean, I think there is a connecting thread across a lot of our episodes, and is the intentionality of things and being in control of that intention and understanding what sits behind the intention. Because I feel like a lot of people, and especially nowadays, when everything is just as simple as a click, you don't know the ramifications, let's say, the butterfly effect of that one click in your business. Probably not tomorrow, but the day after or the day after that. It's super interesting,
it makes it,
just because it's easy doesn't mean that it's the right decision.
Well, yeah, when you think about the internationals, and let's stick with that for a minute. You think about when you switch something on, and new countries on, and you think of all the additional little costs here and there, whether it's the additional few quid for the carrier, and the additional work that it needs from a label, and all of these, and you add in returns, add in customer service, and sometimes you need a different language, and all these. There's lots of little elements that don't get caught. They don't get caught until later, and so it all looks like it's. And look, international for me, it's a huge opportunity for brands to really create a lot of interest and change. And some of the work that we've been playing around with recently, especially on UK brands that want to go into Dubai especially, is so exciting for them, because it's such a growing market in e-commerce. It's like, feels like, I was joking with someone, like, e-commerce is like maybe it's 10 years ahead in terms of the market for the amount of investment, and it's like 10 years behind in terms of the expertise. And yet there is this huge opportunity for UK brands especially and food supplements in particular, making plays into there, but the complications are huge if you don't do it in a intentional way.
Yeah, and I think you know, as you go, and I think the probably now looking backwards to the beginning of the episode, about your new role as expansion architect, you can see why is such. Like there is so many different elements that need to be put together, that need to be thought of, when that sits behind that one click, or even previous to that one click, that brands need to take into consideration. Whether that's, obviously in your case, you're focusing on expansion because there is a big need and there is a great opportunity, like you said, for brands. But even right now, right on home market, understanding all those different elements as well, and probably even more so before you start that expansion, because, if you don't have your stuff together
Yeah,
at
your
home first.
foundations must be right, and that's what that there was the kind of unexpected reality of what I was doing was started with this international expansion architect, but actually expansion architecture became just expanding your business by understanding your contribution became almost the first part of the process. So and that worked for any organization in any country doing, and it often was just a small amount of work of sitting down and holding a mirror up to, this is what the business is doing, and can you explain all of these things? Stuff that in the olden days, that was what we had to do in order to get approval for a budget for a media campaign, etc., etc. We had, this was what the financial team would hold up in front of us. So it's doing that, because I think some of that, the art of that, has maybe been a little bit lost, and yet it's fun to be able to do that with brands, because the light bulb moments that go off as you go through that, and you don't do it in a financial brain way. I'm doing this from operational marketing. As I said earlier, I'm not a financial guy. I'm a marketing and operations guy who can explain this importance of this stuff in a different way. I'm not just a financial guy looking at the bottom line and arguing a point.
It is true. I had a dog that used to put his paws in his eyes, thinking that nobody else was seeing him, because if you don't, if I don't see you, you don't see me, type of thing.
Yeah,
I feel like many times people are afraid of what sits behind that mirror, and so you kind of like avoid it. I've been guilty of that in the past. But then once you kind of like unveil that and actually sit down and with an honest effort, and at the end of the day, it's accountability. Just because you're not looking at it doesn't mean they exist.
yeah,
It's there. Probably even worse because you're not having a handle on it. And something that I've been doing, especially the last couple of years with my with my financial manager, is not only understanding the P&L, is transforming that P&L into a way that actually makes sense for the way we're running the business. Because like the P&L, there isn't a standard way of building P&Ls, but just because it's a standard way, and oftentimes I realized that it was not until I sit down with my financial manager and I start explaining how I saw the business and how we were making decisions in the business. And then we started turning the P&L around that. Then we started on, getting the answers that we needed. And and rather becoming a thing of the past and looking backwards, it started becoming a thing of the past from an accountability point of view, but from a future point of view in terms of decision making and, hypothesis making and all that. And then, again, it goes back to the intentionality of things.
yeah.
But really it's about having, realizing that that's part of the business, and probably the core part of the business, like that you need to have in place.
So, as you said, really, I sort of alluded to there, context is everything, right? So, being able to understand the reasons behind the numbers, that context is the crucial component, because sometimes the blips are literally, that's all they are. There's a blip because of something that happened, but you can take that out of the business in the next month, and maybe you're taking it out of your contribution in the next month, and so now you can spend more, and that otherwise you get held back by potentially a out of date financial.
Yeah, 100%. Thomas, it's been great talking to you today. Before we wrap up, anything that you think is important that we haven't covered today, that you think in this context of, contribution margins, of profitability, of architecting your expansion, is there anything else we haven't
So
covered?
look, I think that I'll I'll just reiterate maybe that most of the time what I see in growth is rarely it's rarely a marketing problem that in the obvious sense, as it were, like everything you see from testing creatives, all of those, that growth is obviously hinged around that. But genuinely, what I'm seeing when people talk about expansion is there's an operational architecture issue that needs to be grounded first and found out first. And so what I urge people to do is if you haven't already instilled into your team a very open book method of working with sharing the P&L, and that's something that I really try to do with all my teams in the last 20 years of leadership in organizations, was sitting down with them when the P&L came out and walking through the numbers and what it meant, and then individual meetings. This is the bit that you had an impact in. What can we do? How can you understand? What can I do to help you understand this more? And interestingly, probably the calls I get most from old colleagues now are from them trying to understand an element of a P&L or a number that is reflected in the P&L that they need to get more clarity on it, and it's not necessarily being shared with them. And so I know that it's still organizations and brands are not sharing that information from the top down, and therefore they're missing out on opportunities that are potentially huge opportunities, because the people on the ground who are doing the work are the ones that understand the idiosyncrasies of those numbers.
Yeah, you were the first one of our clients who asked for a version of a P&L to be built into answers and to have visibility of that alongside with all the rest of the
And
information.
I'm sorry to say it doesn't surprise me, but it's like it
But
shouldn't be the case. But yeah, it's
but
and
but
the
yeah,
difference
it
it
is
made was
true,
huge.
right? I mean, and but it also kind of like speaks about the level of maturity that's had, and obviously you guys were working with very tiny contribution
Yeah,
margins, which meant that even more so you needed to be in control of those things, because it was in that control that will give you the scale. But you could argue that that should be the case for any business, to be able to have a handle at that level of kind of like a granularity, but like you said, to being open to everybody else in the business, and
yeah.
for them
I
to be
like
able
I
to see
said,
it.
the risk of being more open is very rarely outweighing the benefits of that. And there's very few reasons. And unless you're a publicly traded organization, you have certain numbers you've got to be more careful of. But even then, within the organization, there are structures in place to prevent those leakages of confidential numbers. I maintain throughout my career that the risk of sharing cool stuff to employees all the way through the organization generally is outweighed by the benefits of someone who knows something sharing it and having an aha because of it, and that changing the dynamics of something that the organization is doing.
100%. Thank you, Thomas. Really appreciate
Hey,
it.
it's been a pleasure, and yeah, it's great to catch up again, Gilbert.
Likewise. So, anybody else out there looking to expand your brand, looking to put in practice a lot of the stuff that we talked today, Thomas is your guy. So,
Yeah,
really, really looking
look me
forward.
up on LinkedIn. Yeah, I'm always happy to have a chat with anyone who's worried about like the what they're doing with contribution or what they're doing with expansion. I'm very happy to have a chat and see if I can point them in the right direction.
Thomas, thank you very much. Cheers. Bye.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.